On May 30th, 1860, in western Pennsylvania, a horrible storm would cause many tornadoes, but one would be the worst of them all, and today it has been nearly completely forgotten about. As you can guess, this tornado started as a huge supercell system that would begin to rise in the northeastern direction, heading through southern Pennsylvania and up towards the north. Supercell would eventually drop a small tornado. This tornado would drop on the Foster Farm near the town of Adams, Pennsylvania, and in Sugar Creek Township, Armstrong County. It was a small tornado dashing from farmland to farm and gradually growing in size. It would eventually pass over the Allegheny River near the town of Rymerton. And imagine being one of the steamboat captains, as steamboats were prevalent at the time, running from Pittsburgh to Oil City and taking barrels. It would be pretty crazy to imagine this large gray funnel crossing this large river. It would then begin to cross a large plateau of land that sits between the Redbank and Mahoning Creeks in Armstrong County, near the towns of Widnoon and Distant. It's pretty crazy to me that a tornado of this magnitude was able to cross over this large hill section of land. It was reported that the tornado would bound, jumping up and over the haulers, small creek beds, but eventually it would begin to show off its true strength. It was estimated that the tornado was about a quarter to a half mile wide at its peak, and it was coming down the mountain into a town today known as St. Charles, which right now consists of only a few dwellings and a bridge, but at that time it still was a pretty small town, though likely more, vibrant than it is now. But most importantly to the story, this was where the mouth of the Leatherwood Creek is, and where it winds up north further into Clarion County. This is where it truly began, when the tornado would unleash its full fury upon the land, and it would start at the Hassan store, which it completely destroyed, as well as hundreds upon hundreds of trees, leaving almost nothing but a path of wreckage and debris. It began to pass up the Leatherwood Creek, where it had come to the farm of William Shoemaker. Shoemaker's house was torn down to the floor, and his farm, barn, and orchard were never able to be found, likely sucked up into the tempest and torn to shreds, granulated. Both of the poor man's legs were broken, and fear for his infant arose when its cradle was unable to be found. Luckily, the baby, which had previously been lowered into the man's basement, was found unharmed. Large, flat stones, which he built his house and foundation of, were found wedged in the ground so deep that they could not be retrieved, and most scary of all, within the tree trunks surrounding his house. The house of Valentine Miller was destroyed, except for the chimney, around which the family was huddled, and they would end up surviving. The tornado would experience a horrifying change as it continued to ravage farms, housing, and other buildings. You have to understand that at the time, there was no electricity in the area. The only thing there were kerosene lamps, which were all over the place and were inside of these houses and all over these farms. The tornado crashed through all of these, wound up picking up these kerosene lights. This would catch the debris within the storm on fire, and it would begin to spurt black flames and smoke and shoot fire across the land, catching forests on fire. If your building had not been destroyed by the large tornado, it was likely set ablaze. The tornado would begin approaching the town of New Bethlehem, which had around 300 residents. If it had passed through New Bethlehem, it likely would have killed hundreds, but instead, fate chose otherwise, and it turned just a half mile north and went instead into the heights, continuing to destroy farmlands and light everything around it on fire, destroying and burning dozens of buildings. It would continue to cross a few more hollers and creeks, and it would eventually come to its peak. It was about a quarter of a mile wide, and into the small town of New Maysville it went, which today is the town of Mayport. It was located on the Redbank Creek on the foot of a valley. The town consisted of 20 to 30 buildings, including several homes, hotels, stores, and its main center, a large grist mill situated on the creek. There was also a large bridge that crossed the Redbank Creek. The huge tornado narrowed like a cat's eye and came into the town, beginning to destroy everything. Keep in mind, this was a time of great religion. Everybody in the town was Christian, and when the skies turned dark and you see a huge rolling black cloud shooting fire and smoke and glowing bright orange, you can imagine the way these people probably felt. Not for one would believe that they had seen hell. The tornado caused a great many death and injury throughout the town, as every building in the town was ripped apart. Not a single thing remained. The tornado at first came through the northwest of town, pulling up houses and hotels, and many were killed. Its final act of disastrous destruction was even when it came to the mill. The wooden mill itself stood no chance and was completely torn to shreds. However, the most impressive part is that this large tornado picked up the 1,000 to 2,000 pound stone milling burrs from out of this factory and threw them like small pebbles in the nearby creek and mill. Then finish off by pulling the new bridge off of its stone foundations before moving north, completely tearing it apart. It would cross through several more forested areas and would make a reappearance south of the town of Brookville, where it caused immeasurable damage to trees, killed livestock, and destroyed many more houses and farms before dispersing just west of Reynoldsville and continuing to pass on. The storm would pass well over 100 miles and would eventually drop another deadly tornado, this time in the north of Pennsylvania. Starting in Pennsylvania, it would cross the border near the town of Sayre and ended up passing through Waverly, New York, killing a single person and injuring 10. A great mark of the Redbank tornado was hours later, after traveling well over 100 miles. The storm had come into Union County, Pennsylvania, where a small object landed on the ground. It was a book that had belonged to the miller of the town, completely intact. It had traveled well over 100 miles. This storm represents one of the scariest and most destructive storms of the 19th century, but goes almost completely forgotten. Likely, it was overshadowed by a much worse storm that crossed through the state of Iowa and Illinois just 4 days later, causing its most known tornado as the Comox tornado. The tornado caused even more significant damage than anybody could have imagined. It launched heavy objects very long distances, scoured the earth 2 to 5 feet deep, which is something very rarely seen and something that only incredibly powerful tornadoes can do. And it would also lodge many solid objects within trees, another rare feat. Rest in peace to the 7 who were killed by the tornado. Notable miracles would occur, such as when coming through the town of New Maysville, a little girl named Ida was resting in her crib. The 2-month-old baby's mother was killed by flying debris, and she was inside of a building when it collapsed. And eventually, rescuers came to find her, but did not find her crib. Instead, found a large pile of brick and cinder. When it was lifted, the baby was found. The tornado is scary because it's so monumental, but so completely forgotten, and it is hardly ever mentioned. Even when it happened, it was quickly forgotten about, likely due to the aforementioned tornadoes in Iowa. Now, what do I think of this storm? Well, I wouldn't really think much of it if it weren't for the specific damage that it caused throughout its lifespan. And there are 2 or 3 things. The biggest one was the 3 to 5 foot deep scouring it did across its journey, which is something reserved for only the strongest, most beastly tornadoes there are. Another thing was the time it picked up the milling burrs in Maysville and hucked them into the nearby milling pond. And finally, while most tornadoes can do this, the sheer amount of destruction, mainly to forests, it was quoted as pulling up entire groves of trees and pulling them out of the ground with nothing but holes remaining. And there would be stretches of this pattern over a half of a mile wide, which is insane. I feel like this storm is sort of adjacent to one like Valonia, which happened in 2014, Wheelersburg, that happened in 1968, and the Teton Wilderness tornado that happened in 1987, all of which happened to be very strong tornadoes, but managed to overcome the huge height elevations. You see, this tornado crossed through several valleys many times, crossing through the Allegheny, the Redbank a few times, and the Leatherwood, as well as the Pine Creek later on near Brookville. It was incredible how many times it crossed incredibly huge height differences, but still remained at its peak. Now, what should this tornado be rated? Well, if it weren't for the previously discussed damage, it probably wouldn't be that remarkable. But due to this, there are only a few times in history I can recall there being ground scouring that bad, such as for the Niles-Wheatland F5, and I think the Philadelphia, Mississippi F5 had really bad ground scouring. This was probably an F5. Probably. Which would mean it would count as maybe the farthest east F5, although I don't know. I was not there, so I can't know. I'm just going off of what I've heard, but there's a strong case for this tornado. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.